Dear colleagues, students, friends of classical antiquity, you may imagine what it means to me as a German to be invited to this meeting of the Israel Society of Classical Studies. We all know that in past times classical education and humanities in my country have not helped to avoid terrible cruelties and atrocities. But nevertheless, we must not give up the confidence that classical studies and humanities can help to promote and expand our understanding of basic human conditions and to create bridges of solidarity and togetherness. In this sense, I'm most grateful to all of you for this invitation. Most grateful to Lisa Morris for the marvelous hospitality my wife and I found here in Tel Aviv, and above all to Professor Finkelberg for her very promising introduction. I'm going to speak, do you understand me? To the back, yeah? Okay. I'm going to speak on images in classical scholarship. Among archaeologists, it has for decades become obvious to interpret ancient works of art in historical contexts, while among historians and philologists, it has increasingly become customary to take images beside texts seriously as historical testimonies. Quite obviously, this is a welcome development of overcoming artificial barriers that for a long time have restricted our perspectives. The fundamental problem of the separation of our classical disciplines is not that disciplines were constituted, but how the boundaries were drawn, namely according to groups of testimonia or media, such as texts, inscriptions, papyri, coins, images, material culture, and not according to the themes and realms of historical life, such as religion, myth and theater, politics and social life, gender, war and death, etc. That is, not focusing on real historical societies and their conditions and situations of life. For all such themes, there is no comprehensive competence. They are divided among different disciplines. Yet, obviously, in the real world of past societies, there are no separate philological, archaeological, or epigraphical people, nor no media-specific cults and myths, politics and social practices, but only entire human beings in complex historical circumstances. So far, my plea, not only for transgressing, but for ignoring interdisciplinary boundaries. On the other hand, there is the basic fact that the media indeed exist, with their specific capacities of shaping their issues, entailing specific scientific methods of dealing with them. Texts, images, and material culture transport very different, often almost incompatible aspects of historical societies, the interpretation of which requires specific competences. In this sense, I'm going to deal today with images as a section of the entire spectrum of testimonies, which only together provide an idea of the ancient societies. What has absolutely to be avoided is using images only for supplementing or even worse for illustrating texts and vice versa. What is necessary is the disposition on all sides to take texts, images, and material culture seriously as testimonies sui generis, also concerning such phenomena that appear only in these specific media. For investigating images as historical documents, it is first of all essential to make a basic distinction between their function as media of specific themes and their roles as factors within specific social practices. That is, between the world of images and the culture of images. Traditional archaeology, as far as it conceives itself as a historical discipline, is largely oriented towards the world represented by images, investigating, for example, Greek vase images, Greek vase paintings as testimonies of social life or mythology, or interpreting Roman public monuments as documents of historical events, important persons, or political programs. In this sense, images are taken as testimonies of themes that have their existence outside and beyond the image itself. Beside, and actually prior to this function, images are by themselves factors in social practice, in actions of and interactions between human beings. In this sense, they are elements within specific cultures of images. These two aspects of images imply also different uses. Images as testimonies, on the one hand, are objects of comprehension and interpretation. Images as factors of cultural practice are elements in social life. The importance of this distinction becomes immediately evident in front of any Roman portrait. Normal viewers might start from the expectation that such portraits convey an immediate view of historical persons without needing any scientific translation. As archaeologists, however, or art historians, we are aware of how misleading this kind of immediate observation can be. For a spontaneous viewer, a portrait of Caracalla might appear as an expression of bad and cruel character, while statues of private persons could be regarded as contradictory combinations of ideal bodies derived from classical Greek prototypes with mediocre realistic physiognomies. Only when we realize that all portraits of Roman emperors were public monuments, and most portrait statues of private individuals belonged to tomb monuments, and that they are part of specific practices of public celebration and self-representation, then we are forced to conclude that such portraits necessarily must represent those persons in a positive, honorific sense. Generally speaking, images are cultural constructs. Their significance can only be understood according to the cultural categories of their specific societies as elements of their society's comprehensive culture of images. This leads to the quest of the social role of images. For what purposes were they produced? Why were they observed? What was their function in the interaction between their authors, that is, their patrons and artists, on the one hand, and their receivers, that is, their users and viewers, on the other hand? I come first to cultural practice, what I mean with living with images. Why did the ancient societies of Greece and Rome produce images? An answer to this question can be provided on two different levels. The first level is categories and theories. On a general level, one can ask why these societies have at all created this thick and complex culture of images, as perhaps no other society in world history has done. For an answer to this question, one may start from the most general function of images. Images serve to give to specific events and persons a visual presence which they in fact do not possess in this space. The gods of Mount Olympus, the heroes of former times, the deceased ancestors in the underworld are made present through images in the world of living men, assigning them a place in the here and now, and not in separated spaces of museums, which did not exist in antiquity, but in the central areas of public life, in civic and trans-civic sanctuaries, in public spaces and buildings, in private houses, on tombs. And it is because of this emphatic intention of making present beings and events that the human body plays such a dominant role in Greek and Roman art. Therefore, every theory of Greek and Roman images must start from concepts of the body. Such images fulfill specific functions within their societies. Ancient societies do not only consist of their living members, but include, conceptually, three other social groups: the gods, the heroes of the mythical past, and the deceased ancestors. The social life of these conceptual communities consists to a high degree of communicative interactions between these groups. In the living men's rituals form and discourses on the gods, the heroes, and the ancestors, and vice versa, in the gods, the heroes, and the ancestors' activities within the world of present-time societies. Within the ancient cities, these groups possess their specific spaces: sanctuaries, agora, and public buildings, and necropolis. Within these spaces, images make these distant beings present for concrete social interaction. Every theory of Greek and Roman images must therefore also imply a theory of these conceptual communities. In this context, one has to consider the ontological status of images according to Greek and Roman concepts. As we know from literary sources, the cult statues of the gods were regarded and treated as living beings. They were carried around in processions, washed in rivers or in the sea, clothed and adorned, and so forth. Statues of human beings were given crowns during public festivals, included in sepulchral rites, praised and imitated as examples of political virtues. Images make those distant beings present for social communication and interaction. This leads, moreover, to the question of the concrete social and cultural practice through which and for which images were produced in Greek and Roman antiquity. Images do not originate through some autonomous act of creativity for autonomous acts of perception, but are produced with specific intentions for specific functions in specific situations of life. Every genre of images has its specific rules of production and reception. Cult images in temples for ritual veneration, votive images for gift exchange with the gods, public monuments for glorifying famous events and persons of merit, sepulchral images for commemorating the dead as members of the community, painted vases for use in significant social situations such as the symposium, marriage, or funerals, adorned instruments for rituals and religious cult, and so forth. It is in those specific social spaces and situations that images are put into action. Thus, every theory of images in antiquity must be embedded in a theory of social actions and social spaces. In this general sense, images fulfill three different fundamental functions: representation, decor, and figurative discourses. Representation is the primary function of full-sized statues. Cult images of gods and heroes, sepulchral images of the dead, public images of persons of merit give these beings a physical presence as social partners, as receivers of cult, addressees of rituals, examples of public behavior. Images of representation serve to make conceptual communities present. Decor means the embellishment of cultural objects from instruments of social practice to public architecture with ornamental or figurative motives. In adopting this term, decor, one has to free oneself of the modern notion of purely formal and superficial decoration. The basic function of decor has its origin in a fundamental condition of human culture. Every object of significant cultural practice has to be distinguished as an object of cultural value. This distinction can be achieved through various devices of material and visual decor. Precious materials, perfect workmanship, rich ornamentation, or significant figurative decoration. Think of the golden chest from the royal tomb of Vergina with the Macedonian star. Think of symposium vessels with applied figures, of Roman cinerary urns with sepulchral relief motifs, and even temples with metopes, friezes, and pediments. Decor, in this sense, serves to confer visual significance to human culture. Figurative discourses, the third point, are triggered when figurative decoration attains to a kind of autonomy, representing its themes with a specific visual emphasis. Thus, many figurative scenes on Greek vases are more than an added decoration. They often expand to complex narrative compositions, likely to become objects of vivid discourses during the symposium. And Roman public monuments with programmatic relief decoration could visualize manifold political messages. In this sense, images serve to give themes of social significance visual presence in public and private discourses. These three functions of images, representation for social practice, decoration for enhancing cultural value, and visualization for social discourses, are fundamental for the formation of complex and self-reflexive societies. As a rule, they do not occur in pure form, isolated form. Narrative scenes as well as decorative images also serve to make present, while autonomous statues can as well be used for decoration and arouse social discourses. Yet all images can be subsumed under these three functions, and normally one of them proves to be dominant. Now, the second point after theories is images in social practice. All works of art were destined to be elements of social practice, to be used in specific situations for specific purposes according to specific rules. Cult images, votive statues and statuettes, athletes' images, grave statues, public honorary monuments, wall paintings, painted faces, and so forth. For an example, we may turn to the well-known genre of public honorary statues in Republican Rome. These portrait statues were part of a complex and more or less systematic practice mediating between the claims of the leading politicians and their recognition from part of the from the part of the community. The res publica was in need of the leadership and the ambition of individual statesmen, and at the same time had to insist on their integration into the citizens' community. The Senate had various possibilities to distinguish individual persons for their merits, in particular in war. On the one hand, the ephemeral ceremony of the triumph, on the other hand, the enduring honor of a public image. The army leaders, in turn, had, in a certain sense, to give back their victory to the Roman people, in particular by erecting monuments, temples, and public buildings, which they financed from their personal booty in favor of the community. This balance between the interests of the leading statesmen and the community of citizens was strongly disrupted in the 1st century BC, when mighty army commanders more and more promoted their excessive ambitions by public monuments, which they erected on their own initiative. Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Julius Caesar opposed each other in a veritable war of public manifestations, erecting provocative monuments, destroying their opponents' monuments, and re-erecting those monuments that their opponents had demolished, You see one of these examples, this monument for Sula, which we have the richly adorned basis and pedestal, and the statues are reproduced on a coin of Sula's son Faustus. Augustus, finally, turned the whole practice of setting monuments into a new balance between the claims and expectations on both sides. Now, the initiative was normally taken by the Senate of the people, who used to offer to the emperor far-reaching honors, which he, in an act of performative modesty, did not accept. And in the end, they agreed on a middle position, as in the case of the Arapaces, where all this is well attested by Dio Cassius. By this procedure, the position of the princeps could be each time negotiated between the poles of monarchic power and civilitas. In this sense, monuments served to express public consensus to the rule of the emperor. The entire imperial policy of erecting public monuments and buildings was marked by this reciprocal practice. The emperor used to build fora, temples, theaters, and public baths for the people, establishing thereby implicitly his lasting fame, whereas all monuments of explicit glory, such as honorary arches or public portrait statues, were set up in his favor by other institutions. In Rome, above all, by the Senate and the people. In Italy, by the provinces, by the cities, or by various other entities. Particularly obvious examples are the fora of Augustus and Trajan in Rome, which were donated by these emperors to the Roman people, to which the Senate and the people responded with the central quadriga monument for Augustus and the famous column for Trajan. The column was characteristically even inaugurated at a separate date in order to make the nations make them different. By this practice, public spaces and buildings were equipped with appropriate visual themes of public significance. In this sense, Vitruvius criticizes the people of Alabanda, a provincial town in Asia Minor, for having erected on their agora statues of athletes, whereas their sports buildings were full of lawyers. The normal practice, which was different obviously, is defined by the Athenian statesman Lycurgus, who praises the Athenians for having on their agora no athletes at all, but only famous statesmen. Thus, there existed certain standards defining which types of images were appropriate for which places and spaces of social life. Yet, these standards were not strictly fixed, for of course the people of Alabanda too had their reasons for their practice. They just defined their agora in a different way. The same applies to other civic areas, gymnasia, public libraries, public baths, private houses, gardens. Everywhere images were elements of spaces of life. They were selected according to the character of these spaces, and vice versa gave these spaces a specific character. Within such spaces of social life, images served to make beings and events from the distance of time and space present, not only for aesthetic contemplation, but for social interaction. Dealing with the question of visual practice, seeing and understanding. How did ancient societies look at their images? And how can we understand these images today? For giving an answer to this, we must first of all bear in mind what we mean today by understanding, and what understanding meant to an ancient era. Today, in particular as present-time historians, we look at ancient images from 2 points of view. Firstly, we want to recognize the subjects presented in images, and to learn about what they looked like. For example, a Greek symposium or a Roman scene of sacrifice. And secondly, we want to understand these subjects' cultural meaning. In semiotic terms, we may speak of factual denotation and cultural connotation. Approaching these two questions as problems of the historian's methodology means to ask how far the medium of images as such, that is, without support by other media, such as texts, is capable to fulfill these interests. In this sense, we may ask how far can we recognize and understand ancient images by mere looking at them. This, however, is very far from the attitudes of ancient viewers towards images. On the one hand, an ancient viewer did not have to learn very much from images. A Roman citizen approaching an altar with a scene of sacrifice was sufficiently informed about how and why a sacrifice was performed. And he knew, moreover, the cultural significance of sacrifices as an expression of pietas. On the other hand, if he turned around and his look fell on a depiction of a gigantomachy, he could recognize it only if he had already some knowledge of the fight between the gods and the giants. Without this previous knowledge, he saw just some dramatic struggles against monstrous beings. That means, to ancient viewers, images did not provide much factual information. Either they represented things that were well known to them, or things that they could not recognize from the image as such. Quite different is the situation of modern viewers, in particular modern historians. We actually want to recognize and learn factual things and themes that are unknown to us. And we aim to understand the cultural meaning of those themes we have recognized. Nevertheless, our situation is actually not much better than that of ancient viewers, at least as long as we try to comprehend images from themselves without supporting text, as we will see. First, recognizing the triumph relief of the Arch of Titus, which at first sight seems to be easy to understand, is from itself almost incomprehensible. We need information from written sources on the ritual of a Roman triumph, the costume and attributes of Roman lictors, the conquest of Jerusalem, and many other historical facts. By such written sources, we compensate for the lack of cultural experience and knowledge that the ancient viewers had acquired in real life. The same applies, by the way, of images to images of post-antique culture. Without knowledge from oral or written tradition, we wouldn't even recognize the nativity of Christ. Second, understanding. Cultural significance, too, does not become very clear from images as such. We learn what the triumphal chariot and the lictors' fasces looked like, and get precious testimonies about them from the menorah, about the form of the menorah, the trumpets, the holy table, and so on. But by no means can we gather from the depiction the ideological significance of the triumph ritual and its political insignia, the implicit concepts of virtus and pietas, dignitas and auctoritas, nor can we guess from the image, the paramount significance of the booty as the highest symbols of Jewish religion and identity. Generally speaking, the purpose of images is not to give information. Or more precisely, images are not created and set up in order to transfer viewers from total ignorance to comprehensive knowledge about their themes. Neither do images possess such capacities, nor is this their intention, which means that neither the authors, patrons and artists, nor the users and viewers were primarily orientated towards factual information. I come now to the opposite aspect, and that is living with images. Here the immense difference becomes clear between our modern interest in historical images and the way the ancient societies themselves dealt with their own images. This difference is already evident in the institutions of art. Our modern encounter with art takes place in museums and in books. That is, in limited spaces of historical education, marked off from normal life and reserved for intensive and exclusive contemplation. In Greek and Roman antiquity, these institutions and the corresponding museum habit did not, or at best in a very rudimentary form, exist. Images were elements of social life. They represented the conceptual community of gods, heroes, and ancestors, as well as the conceptual world of mythical events and typical situations of life, which the society of living people considered significant for themselves within their living spaces. Dealing with images did not mean exclusive contemplation and interpretation with the aim of expanding one's knowledge and education. It meant living with images in the spaces of public sanctuaries, of the agora, at the tombs, and in private residences. All this is less obvious than it appears to be. In fact, scholars permanently, scholars permanently use to impose their own scientific notions, and even more problematically, their cultural habit on the ancient societies. Thus, the famous portrait statue of Augustus from Prima Porta is explained by scholars as an intentional reference to the Doryphoros of Polycletus, presupposing spectators with a detailed knowledge of the assumed classical original, its specific stance, actions of the left arm, and turn of the head, which is probably wishful thinking of modern scholars in search of equally learned colleagues of classical antiquity. A symptomatic example is the ubiquitous assumption of the existence of museums in antiquity. Temples, public places, private residences, and even the entire city of Rome, with its manifold decoration of statues and paintings, are interpreted as vast museums where educated Romans dedicated themselves to the study of Greek art. These viewers are imagined as highly competent experts focusing on precise art historical interpretation, disposing of comprehensive knowledge of historical iconography, typology, and styles. In fact, however, all works of art, Greek originals as well as new Roman statues and paintings, which were exhibited in Rome, were relocated in their new Roman contexts, not according to criteria of art history, but for their themes as conceptual visualizations of the character of these social spaces. There, people did not so much study works of art, but live with images constituting their conceptual world. Now, we come to another part, and that is themes, reproduction of reality and production of significance. If we start from the premise that images represent such beings and objects, events and situations that are of specific significance, and that they represent their themes in those aspects that constitute their significance, then it becomes clear what historians can gain from images. An insight into which themes were of specific significance for specific societies in specific historical situations, and moreover, why and in which, oh thank you very, very much, and in which sense they were significant. The theoretical and methodological problem in this respect is how can significant meaning be visually produced and how can it be recognized? Visual art can only represent concrete beings and objects. In social life, reality, cultural meaning can be attributed to specific motives, beings and objects, But normally this does not affect their visual appearance as it is produced in images. In art, there are four principal devices of conferring meaning to the themes represented. Selecting specific subjects from the multiplicity of themes in real life or imagination. Emphasizing specific motives, shaping their visual appearance, and referring to symbolic connotations. As an example, we may choose Roman representations of sacrifice. For example, a scene from the Arch of Trajan at Benevento. Here, as in most other scenes of sacrifice, a significant selection can be observed. From the complex sequence of this ritual, two stereotyped scenes are depicted. To the right, the preliminary offering of incense and wine, and to the left, the slaughter of the bull. Moreover, a significant accent is put by representing the main person, be it either the emperor or another dignitary, always performing the preliminary libation, although this was not the main action of the ritual. The reason for this must have been that the protagonist had to be represented in authoritative dignity, which was possible only in the preliminary libation scene. There, he could be shown in formal dignity, holding the libation bowl, emphasizing his rank by cult servants equipped with further significant cult instruments, incense box, wine jug, and so forth. The killing of the animal, which in fact was more important but also more tumultuous, was left to specific slaughter servants and set aside. During the real ritual, these aspects of dignity and dramatic emotions must have been tightly mixed, whereas in the image they are intentionally separated, the content of dignity being reserved for the protagonist. From the multiple aspects of reality, specific persons and objects are selected which are essential for the intended message. In this sense, Roman art is on the one hand, in general, basically realistic, but at the same time extremely selective. Many aspects are not depicted at all. Realism goes precisely as far as reality was considered to transport meaning. This applies to all kinds of elements within the picture. For cult instruments as instruments of piety, for clothes as indicators of social positions, for insignia as symbols of public rank, and so on. As has often been emphasized, the scenes of Roman public monuments serve as exemplary models of political virtues and public behavior. Scenes of sacrifice, you see one of them in a big relief above, demonstrate pietas and providentia, military victory proofs virtus, speeches of army leaders promise fides and concordia, the reception of defeated enemies exemplifies clementia or justitia, and the distribution of money shows liberalitas, and so forth. You see that all these scenes or all these themes in an abbreviated form are explained on coins with these concepts. Man sacrificing, you see here pietas, you see here a submission in front of the emperor with clementia, and you see here the cult instruments again with the exclamation pietas. Besides full-size scenes of action, selected motives too could express similar messages. Pietas could also be represented by a portrait statue of the emperor with a veiled head, or by compositions of cult instruments. Selected reality could transport ideological messages in manifold forms, in actions, persons, or objects. Thus, Roman public art presenting political and social reality proves to be, to a high degree, a construct of ideological meaning. Yet it would be totally misleading if this construction of meaning is exclusively attributed to the creative power of art, by which mere reality is given a meaningful form and visual significance in the work of art. For this is wrong. For on the one hand, real life actions too are expressions of ideological values. Rituals of sacrifices and triumph, speeches to the soldiers, and the distribution of money are no less demonstrations of pietas, virtus, concordia, and liberalitas than representations in art. On the other hand, in real life, two such events were intentionally staged as ritual and ceremonious performances, conveying to the emperor's public appearances a powerful visual impact. In general, the theory of media has made us aware of the fact that images are not just reproductions but constructs of reality. This, however, does not imply a diametrical opposition of images on the one hand and reality on the other. For the reality of social and cultural life too is a construct. Our material world, as well our social actions and interactions, are more or less consciously shaped by ourselves, that is, by human beings, and the forms of this material and performative reality are full of cultural meaning. The real world of life too is a medium, an image. Of course, its material conditions are different from the art of images, but it achieves in an analogous way visual communication. As a conclusion to this part, Greek and Roman works of art represent social and political reality with a kind of selective realism, presenting events, persons, and objects as incorporations of ideological messages. They are to a high degree artificial constructs, but as such they correspond to the constructed character of the real world of art. I come now as a consequence to programs of images, worlds of images. It is well known that in big public monuments, such exemplary forms, such exemplary images could be composed in the sense of multiform political programs. The Arapaces or the Arch of Trajan at Benevento are impressive examples of such comprehensive ideological concepts, constituting entire systems of political, social, and ethical values. Even more complex is the pictorial war report on the column of Trajan, where the emperor's campaigns are described in an extremely detailed sequence of scenes, which obviously are orientated in all essentials to the reality of events, and nevertheless are so rigorously filtered as to produce an almost systematic display of the Roman ideology of war and victory. The huge interest of such programs, which have no equivalent in other documents, has for long been recognized. Perhaps even more revealing is the phenomenon of entire repertoires of images created by historical societies, or more concrete, worlds of images inhabited by these societies. Famous examples are the wonderful French project La Cité des Images, by which painted vases from archaic and classical Greece or Athens were interpreted not as documents of real life, but as a manifold imaginaire of concepts and counter-concepts, visions and utopias that guided the social behavior, communication, and interaction within these polis societies. And for the Roman world, there is Paul Zanker's book on Augustus and the Power of Images, in which he unfolds a broad panorama of the public and private atmosphere under the first Roman emperor. Looking in this sense at the more limited space of political art, the repertoire of Roman state monuments is characterized by two striking features. First, the emperor is very rarely represented in efficient activities of government. Mostly he appears as the protagonist of solemn state rituals. in scenes of dignified sacrifices, ceremonious departure from and return to Rome, speeches to the soldiers, reception of defeated enemies, celebration of the triumph, and so forth. Second, these themes remain more or less unchanged during the 2 centuries of the early and middle empire. This concept of history is fundamentally different from Greek state monuments. In Greek public art, state ceremonies or rituals are almost absent. The Parthenon frieze, and with the Panathenaic procession, is absolutely exceptional. The focus is here, in Greece, on great feats and fundamental changes of history. The monument of the Athenian tyrant slayers celebrates the end of tyranny and the beginning of the new democratic state as a total reversal of the public order. The lost mural painting of the Battle of Marathon in the Stoa Poikile on the Athenian Agora glorifies the Greek victory over the Persians as an event of world historical significance. And the same applies to the dramatic depiction of the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius III, which is conceived as the final encounter of Greek heroism and Asian despotism. The role of Roman emperors is totally different. They perform representative state ceremonies, incorporating thereby specific ideological concepts, political virtues, and ideals of behavior, and this state ideology remains valid with only minor modifications from Augustus to late antiquity. In Greece, the emphasis is on dynamic energy and historical change, in Rome on static performance of a normative role. Every emperor was expected to fulfill this role and the corresponding set of ideological virtues in the best possible way. I come to the last part, and this is the form, style, and history. The biggest challenge of art for historical interpretation comes from the forms of style. Beginning with Winkelmann, historians of Greek and Roman art have analyzed processes of stylistic change which are characterized by a certain coherence, resulting in typical epoch styles: archaic, classical, Hellenistic, Augustan, Flavian, Hadrianic, Severan, late antique. Although this linear concept of stylistic change has been rightly criticized in various respects, the phenomenon as such is beyond any doubt. If, however, this is accepted as a fact, then it cannot be denied that we are dealing with a fact of history. The decisive question is how these changes can be understood in a precise historical sense. As is well known, many different theoretical approaches have been developed aiming to explain the changes of styles in Greek and Roman art. I just focus on one aspect, and that is that the aspect that Greek and Roman art is to a high degree an art of bodies. Therefore, changes of style are above all changes of the concept of man. In a very general sense, one may say that art represents human beings in archaic times as carriers of their bright aristocratic qualities, in classical times as organisms of forces and counterforces, in Hellenistic times as incorporations of physical and emotional energies, and in Roman times as representatives of social rank and values. What remains largely open, however, is the question how and in which way these phenomena of style can be connected with political orders, social structures, religion and mentality of specific historical periods. Now, within the last generation, some approaches have been developed towards an interpretation of the postures, gestures, and facial expressions of Greek and Roman statues in terms of social behavior and public messages. I start with three well-known examples. The portrait of the Athenian statesman Pericles with its classical forms of style, has been convincingly interpreted as an expression of solemn and controlled dignity. The full significance of this interpretation becomes evident when we consider that, on the one hand, this solemn and dignified attitude of Pericles' images is also described as Pericles' intentional appearance in real life, which was obviously esteemed by many of his contemporaries, and that, on the other hand, the style of this portrait corresponds with the general noble style of classical Athenian art. So in this sense, the collective style of classical art corresponds to the forms of a collective social habitus. By contrast, the portraits of Alexander the Great seem to be full of heroic energy expressed by his emotional so-called humid gaze, his lion-like anastole, and the emphatic turn of his head. In his case, too, these iconographic motives of the individual Alexander, of the portraits of Alexander, are described in written sources as characteristic features of Alexander's real appearance. And here, too, these features of his portraits correspond with fundamental forms of style in contemporary art. Again, the emphasis on energy and emotions is an overarching phenomenon in the visual forms of art as well as in real social behavior. In the late Roman Republic, the portraits of leading politicians, such as the famous statue of a general from Tivoli, are characterized by enormous and almost wild psychological energies. In fact, written sources describe the mighty army leaders, Marius and Sulla, in real-life episodes in which they presented themselves with furious and terrifying physiognomies. By contrast, Augustus appears in his portraits with an expression of solemnity and dignity. Again, his expression corresponds, on the one hand, with what written sources say about his serene and dignified appearance in public situations of real life, and on the other hand, this is also a fundamental feature, as you know, of the classicism of early imperial art. In both cases, we find a remarkable analogy between the stylistic forms of art, the visual self-presentation of persons in real life, and a specific ethical and psychological habitus. Along this methodological line, various scholars have recently interpreted forms of art not only as phenomena of aesthetic creativity, but as expressions of social behavior, as a physical and ethical habitus. As for some examples, I remind you of Paul Zanker's investigations on the portraits of Roman emperors and of Greek and Roman intellectuals, Luca Giuliani's analysis of portraits of the Roman Republic, and Jeremy Hanna's interpretation of statesmen of late classical Athens. A fundamental step in this direction, I'm coming to the end, was done by Maria Luisa Catoni in her investigations on non-verbal communication in ancient Greece. She focuses on the so-called schemata of bodies, that is, on significant postures and attitudes, motions and gestures by which social, ethical and psychological behavior is expressed. Such postures, in Greek hexis, in Latin habitus, played an enormous role in social life. In classical Athens, it was crucial for a man's reputation to present himself in public life with an attitude of self-control and sophrosyne, and in Rome, Augustus gave the order that Roman citizens should appear on the forum only in the sumptuous attire of the toga. Public images of famous men, like Aeschines, served as visual examples of these forms of behavior. Politicians, real-life politicians, were criticized when they did not conform to the habit of public honorary statues. Thus, styles in art and styles of life go together. Of course, they do not necessarily coincide in their actual content, or art often goes beyond reality and even creates counter-realities. But both explore, between reality and imagination, a spectrum of visual attitudes which serve social communication. In images, as well as in real life, we have to do with visual forms of habitus that includes aesthetic and social values. This allows us to connect this approach with Pierre Bourdieu's concept of the social and cultural habitus. His theory of the habitus as the basic principle of social action includes particularly the phenomena of style, styles of life as well as styles of art. For Greek and Roman art, with its specific focus on the human body, the category of the habitus seems to be particularly fruitful because from its Latin origin, the term habitus means basic physical attitudes which at the same time include a person's individual character and its collective cultural behavior. At the end of this discourse, we may ask the question, how do images exercise their effect on their viewers, and how do the viewers react to images? I just give you one last example, which shows you how it works, models and imitation. A good example of model and imitation can be found on the Sestertius on Antoninus Pius. This emperor had erected, in order to strengthen the institution of marriage, had erected a group of statues representing himself and his deceased wife Faustina, and issuing at the same time the order that all new married couples had to offer a sacrifice to these statues. The coin demonstrates very clearly in which way the imperial statues were meant to serve as models for the couples in real life. So much for these problems. Thank you for your attention.
Two quick questions.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, there is one group of people that very much look at images of the ancient world in their context, and that of course is filmmakers, because they use those filmmakers, people who make films and television programs of the ancient world, because they use that's the ultimate artificial construct of reality. They take those images and they have to create a physical image again. And those people who work in film use film theory very much to look at things like the two-way process, that an image is not just given, it's also received, that images go on to create later images. You mentioned the nativity scene, which of course is based on earlier images that we all have in mind, and so on. I'm just wondering whether those theories, those techniques that we use in film theory is a useful way to go for looking back at the ancient world and trying to understand. And do we even have the tools to do that, or do we not know?
No, I mean, you are absolutely right. I have also to confess that I'm not very well acquainted with this kind of with these theories. Whenever I meet something of that kind, it's always very illuminating, and so one has to go ahead in this direction.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Next question, please.
You talked about the political representation, sorry. The political, we see in the images the political representation that has a political message. I'm wondering if there are mythological subjects in art that have a similar political message.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just left out the whole space of myth. Yeah, of course, myths are created, chosen for, I mean, ideological reasons, yeah, or for conceptual reasons. I mean, depends what you mean by ideology. But anyhow, I mean, political myths, of course. The couple of the virtues, virtus and pietas, are of course represented by Romulus and Aeneas. And so you can go through all that. Roman sarcophagi have been interpreted in terms of visualizations of ideals, ideologies, whatever. I mean, this is a very broad field. The problem by now is, I mean, recently a very serious question has been raised, and that is, how far are we entitled to translate visual, well, they even refuse the term messages, because I mean, it's all the problem of words and images. How far are we entitled to interpret a scene of sacrifice by the term, by the lingual term of pietas? Of course, pietas is a label. An image is a very manifold thing. And so this is just one of the problems we are discussing right now.
Please.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And one question which is probably connected with the previous one, concerning the inscriptions. You mentioned that in the late Republic, those coins showing Sulla, for example, and that probably shows this change in the late Republic concerning how the role of individuals is represented. But I was wondering, for example, when temples were constructed, also not only by magistrates, but also, sorry, I'm again talking about this, by private individuals, and they still made inscriptions showing that this particular individual, even in the Middle Republican period, constructed this particular temple. So the image is not showing anything about the role of this person as the coin with Sulla shows. But inscription shows that this particular person made this temple because he made this promise before he started the war. So the question is, how can we use together image and inscription if when we look only at the image we see this probably difference in the late Republic, but if we look at the inscription which goes together with image in the Middle Republican period, we also be able to see this individualistic element in the Roman writing culture.
But I mean, I absolutely agree with what you have in mind, and that's why I, at the beginning, said we should just neglect divisions, disciplinary divisions. On the other hand, we have to look at the specific media. So what I try to explain is intentionally only a section of the whole spectrum of cultural expression. So, of course, these architectures from the Middle Republic are, of course, highly charged with ideological meaning. And especially since the deities of these, to which these temples were dedicated, were already the same, or more or less the same concepts that we meet in images. That were temples to Salus and to Victoria and to Fides and to Concordia and so on and so on. And of course, inscriptions made that clear. What we have to by now to realize is that they refer to each other. Everything refers refers to each other, but they do not coincide. Yeah? Otherwise, we would just say an image is just a chiffre of pietas, or the term pietas is just can be just translated into an image. That's not possible. Yeah? We have to explore the various meanings, the spectrum of meanings in a word, in an image, in an architecture, and then see all that together.
And one last thing. I would ask now Professor Benjamin Isaac, the editor-in-chief of the Scripta Classicis Verica, to give a copy of our journal to our as a token of our gratitude.
Thank you, Professor Hölscher, for a remarkable display of lucidity. Next time I see this bust of Caracalla, I'll wonder whether the Roman in 215 thought him as nasty as I. So this is the issue that has just
Thank you very, very
come
much.
out.
Very much.